I still remember that night like it just happened yesterday. The house was dead silent. The kind of silence that presses against your skin, makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I should have been asleep. It was late, past midnight. But something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. You know that eerie feeling when you wake up in the middle of the night, and for some reason, you just know something is off? That's what I felt. A tension in the air. A shift in energy. And then I heard it. A voice. Muffled. Low. Coming from down the hall. I held my breath. My stomach tightened. My heart started pounding, hard and fast. I wasn't sure what I was hearing at first. It was too soft. But something about it made my skin prickle. I moved quietly. Slow. Careful. The floor was cold under my bare feet. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and endless. But there, at the end, was a light. A thin, slivered glow beneath a door. His door. Jake's door. I froze. My fingers hovered over the frame. My mind screamed at me to turn around. To go back. To pretend I never heard anything. But then another voice. And this one made my entire body go cold. Because it wasn't his father. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't imagining it. Something was happening behind that door. Something I wasn't supposed to hear. I stood there. Frozen. My breath shallow. My hands shaking. My mind racing. Do I knock? Do I walk away? Do I even want to know? But deep down, I already knew. And what I saw next, it changed everything. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me warn you, this story is not for the faint of heart. It's raw. It's real. It will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and betrayal. If you've ever felt your heart pull you one way and your conscience drag you another, then keep watching. And if you love shocking, real-life stories, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you won't want to miss this. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always the kind of woman who stood frozen outside a door, heart pounding, ears straining for something I shouldn't hear. There was a time when I was happy. Or at least, I thought I was. My name doesn't matter. The only thing you need to know is that I'm a woman in my late 30s, a wife, a mother, someone who gave up little pieces of herself over the years until, one day, there was nothing left. Mark, my husband, used to be different. Or maybe I just used to see him differently. When we first met, he had this way of making me feel like I was the only woman in the world. But life has a way of dulling things, grinding them down until they're nothing but routine. And somewhere between bills, schedules, and years of unspoken resentments, we stopped looking at each other. We weren't fighting. We weren't screaming. We weren't anything. He worked late. He came home tired. He barely noticed me anymore. I was just there, another piece of furniture in the house, another obligation on his list. And I told myself it didn't bother me. That I was fine. That love wasn't always passion, wasn't always fire. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was lonely. Not just the kind of lonely where you miss someone. The kind where you forget what it even feels like to be seen. Then, Jake moved in. He was 19, Mark's son from his first marriage. He was supposed to be staying with us for the summer before heading back to college. I didn't think much of it at first. I had my own son, Ethan, 14, still a kid in so many ways, buried in video games, homework, a world of his own. He didn't notice the shifts in energy. He didn't pick up on the unspoken things. But I did. It started small. A glance held a second too long. A conversation that felt different. Not inappropriate, not at first. Just aware. I brushed it off. He was polite, attentive, nothing more. But it had been so long since anyone really looked at me, really listened. The house was big, too big. The kind of house where silence settled into the corners like dust. During the day, it was just me and Jake. Mark was always working. Ethan was out with friends. The wall stretched wide between us, but something kept pulling us closer. I would find him in the kitchen, shirtless, making coffee. I would catch myself watching, lingering just a little too long before forcing myself to look away. There was a night, one of the first nights, where it all shifted, where I should have walked away but didn't. I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water. Jake was already there, leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. I don't remember what we talked about. Something stupid, something casual. But when I laughed, he looked at me in a way no one had in years. Not like a stepmother. Not like someone off limits. Just a woman. I should have said goodnight. I should have left. But I stood there, my fingers gripping the cool glass, my pulse just a little too fast. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something. Something dangerous. The moment everything changed, I didn't even realize it was happening. Not at first. It was supposed to be just another family outing. Something to break the routine, to pretend, for a little while, that we were like any other family. The beach. The sun was high, the sky a perfect, endless blue. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, kids laughing in the distance. I should have felt light, carefree. But as I stood there, looking out at the water, I felt nothing but empty. Mark was there, of course. Physically. But even here, under the open sky, he was somewhere else. His phone, his emails, his world that never included me anymore. I had planned this. Booked the spot, packed the bags, made sure everything was perfect. And yet, within minutes of arriving, Mark had already found a reason to wander off, some excuse about work, a client call that couldn't wait. I watched him disappear down the shore, phone pressed to his ear, his back turned to us. And just like that, I was invisible again. I shouldn't have cared. I had gotten used to it. But today, something was different. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the water, making everything look sharper, more vivid. Or maybe it was me, the way I had chosen to dress today. A new swimsuit. Nothing scandalous, but different. A little more fitted, a little more revealing than anything I would have worn before. I told myself it was nothing. That I had picked it because I liked the color, the fit. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted to be seen. And someone saw me. I felt it before I even turned around. That slow, unspoken awareness that spreads through your skin when you know someone is looking at you. Jake. He was sitting in the shade, shirt draped over his shoulder, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. But I felt his gaze, heavy, lingering. For a moment, I didn't move. I let the feeling settle, pulse low and steady in my throat. Then, as if on instinct, I turned toward him. And he didn't look away. I should have. I should have laughed it off, turned my back, walked away. But instead, I held his gaze, just for a second too long. Just long enough to feel something shift between us. A silent understanding. A door cracking open. I broke the moment first, swallowing hard, brushing sand off my legs as if that would shake the tension. But the air had changed. I knew it. He knew it. The next moment came too easily, too naturally, as if it had been waiting for the right excuse. "Hey," I said, voice casual, careful. "Can you help me with the sunscreen?" The words tasted normal, innocent. But the second they left my mouth, I felt the weight of them settle between us. Jake didn't hesitate. He pushed himself up, stepping closer, his movements slow, unhurried. I turned, my back to him, pulling my hair over one shoulder. I held my breath. The first touch was light, almost nothing. Just the cool press of lotion against my skin. Then, his hands. Warm. Steady. Moving over my shoulders, my back, smoothing the sunscreen over my skin in slow, deliberate motions. I closed my eyes for half a second. Just half a second too long. Was I imagining this? The way his fingers lingered? The way my skin burned under his touch? Not from the sun, but from something else? His hands moved lower, pausing just above the small of my back. Then they were gone. I turned, too quickly, heart pounding harder than it should have been. Jake met my eyes, unreadable behind his sunglasses. Silence stretched between us. Thick. Charged. And then, like nothing had happened, he gave a small nod, stepping back. "Let me know if you need more," he said, voice low, even. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. Thanks. But my hands trembled as I reached for my towel. I told myself it was nothing. Just sunscreen. Just a moment. But something had changed. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. After that day, Jake started acting differently. Little things. Small shifts in behavior that anyone else would have missed. He started being around more. Offering to help with things he never cared about before. Dishes. Groceries. Setting the table. His eyes lingered longer. His voice softened when he spoke to me. And Mark? Mark was more absent than ever. One night, he came home late. Again. Didn't even look at me when he walked in. Just muttered something about work, dropped his keys on the counter, and went straight upstairs. I stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been. Then I felt it again. That awareness. That presence behind me. I turned. Jake was standing in the doorway, watching. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't in my head. This wasn't nothing. This was just the beginning. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was just lonely. That I was reading too much into things. It was harmless. That's what I kept repeating in my head. Harmless. But the lie never sat right. It curled in my stomach like a stone, heavy and impossible to ignore. Because I knew the truth. Something had shifted inside me. I woke up feeling different, more aware of myself. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman I hadn't seen in years. A woman who took the time to smooth her hair, to pick out a dress that fit just right. Not for anyone else. Not for Mark. For myself. That's what I told myself, at least. But deep down, I knew better. I felt it in the way my pulse quickened when I stepped downstairs and saw Jake already at the table. The way my skin warmed when I caught him watching me, his gaze lingering just a second too long. At dinner, things felt different. Mark barely spoke, barely looked up from his plate. Another long day at work. Another evening where I might as well have been a ghost sitting across from him. But Jake was watching me. It was subtle. A glance over the rim of his glass. A look that flickered too quickly for anyone else to notice. I laughed at something he said, something that wasn't even funny. Mark didn't react. He never did. But Jake? He smiled. Not just a polite smile. Not just friendly. Something else. Something that made my breath hitch, made my heart stumble over itself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt noticed. I was losing myself. I knew it. And I couldn't stop it. It started with small things. I spent longer getting ready in the morning. I bought a new dress, something softer, something that made me feel like a woman again. I told myself it was just self-care, that it had nothing to do with him. But then came the moments I couldn't explain away. The way I'd pause before walking past the living room, hoping, waiting, to see if Jake was there. The way my stomach would tighten when he spoke to me, that low, easy voice that felt too comfortable, too familiar. It was wrong. But it was also the first thing that had made me feel alive in years. One night, after Mark had gone to bed early, like he always did, I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at the wedding photos on the wall. Our wedding day. I traced a finger over the glass, over the smiling woman in the white dress, the man standing beside her. I didn't recognize her anymore. The love that had once been in her eyes? Gone. The way Mark had looked at her? That was gone, too. And maybe it had been gone for a long time. I didn't feel anything looking at those photos. Not regret. Not sadness. Just nothing. And when I turned away, my reflection in the hallway mirror caught my eye. I didn't look sad. I looked like someone standing on the edge of something dangerous. And the worst part? I didn't want to step back. The night it all blurred together. I wasn't looking for trouble. Or maybe I was. Mark had gone to bed early, like he always did. The house was dark, silent except for the faint hum of crickets outside. I should have gone to bed too. Closed my eyes. Pretended this feeling inside me didn't exist. But instead, I found myself on the patio, glass of wine in hand, staring out into the night like it held some kind of answer. And then, Jake. He stepped outside, barefoot, moving easily, like he belonged there. Like he knew I wouldn't send him away. Neither of us spoke at first. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full, buzzing with everything that hadn't been said. Then, quietly, almost too quietly, he said, "You okay?" I almost laughed. Was I okay? I took a slow sip of wine, felt the warmth slide down my throat, and shrugged. I don't know. He sat down across from me, watching me the way he always did. The way I felt even when I wasn't looking. I don't think my dad even sees you anymore, he said. Just like that. No hesitation. No sugarcoating. My fingers tightened around my glass. I should have been angry. I should have told him he was out of line. But the words hit something too deep, too raw, and instead of denying it, I just let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. "Yeah," I whispered. "I don't think he does either." Jake didn't say anything. Just nodded. Like he understood. And maybe he did. The air between us shifted, stretched. My pulse was too loud, too fast. It would have been so easy, in that moment, to let it happen. But instead, I stood up. I should go inside. My voice wasn't steady. Jake didn't move. Didn't argue. He just held my gaze for a long, heavy second before finally nodding. "Good night," he said. I turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind me. But I didn't sleep that night. Because for the first time, I knew. This wasn't just in my head anymore. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. The next morning, Mark mentioned the trip. "I have to be out of town for the weekend," he said, barely looking up from his coffee. "Conference thing. Should be back Sunday night." I nodded, pretending it didn't mean anything. But my heart was pounding. A weekend. Just me. Just Jake. No one watching. No one there to stop anything. I told myself nothing would happen. But the part of me that had already crossed the line in my head, it knew better. The night it happened, the sky was restless. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, the kind that makes the walls tremble. The rain had started slow, a soft patter against the windows, but now it was steady, insistent, drumming against the roof like a warning. I couldn't sleep. I had been lying in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled in things I didn't want to name. Mark was gone. The house was different without him. Quieter. Or maybe I was just more aware of the silence. I got up, moving without thinking, my body leading me before my mind could argue. Down the hallway. Down the stairs. I wasn't looking for him. That's what I told myself. But then I saw him. Jake. Standing in the kitchen, barefoot, shirtless, a glass of water in his hand. The dim light above the stove cast shadows over his face, over the sharp lines of his jaw. He turned when he heard me. Neither of us spoke. The air between us wasn't empty. It was thick, humming with everything we had been avoiding, everything we had been pretending wasn't there. I swallowed, suddenly too aware of my own breathing. "I couldn't sleep," I said. Jake set his glass down on the counter. His eyes didn't leave mine. Me neither. The words felt heavier than they should have. I should have walked away. Should have turned around, gone back upstairs, pretended this was just another night. But I didn't. I stepped forward. Just a little. Just enough. And so did he. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The rain outside was louder now, drowning out the sound of my own heartbeat, the voice in my head screaming at me to stop. Jake's gaze flickered, just for a second, down to my lips. And I felt my breath catch. I don't know who moved first. But suddenly, he was too close, and I was too willing, and there was nothing between us except the inches we were about to erase. His hand brushed my arm, a slow, deliberate touch. A test. A question. And my body gave him the answer before I could even think. I leaned in. But then, footsteps. Soft, but not soft enough. My stomach dropped. Jake took a step back, his expression shifting in an instant, shocked, tense. And then, before I could even turn, the creak of a door. I turned just in time to see him. Ethan. Standing at the edge of the hallway. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes, wide, confused, betrayed, moved from me to Jake and back again, taking in everything. He knew. He didn't have to say a word. The air was thick, suffocating, time stretching painfully between us. And then, he ran. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My body jerked forward, my hand reaching as if I could stop him, but it was too late. His footsteps pounded up the stairs. A door slammed. Silence. And in that silence, I felt everything collapse. I turned back to Jake. His jaw was tight, his hands on the counter, fingers digging into the wood. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. Because the line we had been dancing around? We had just crossed it. And there was no undoing what had just happened. The next morning, everything felt different. Not because the house had changed. Not because the world had shifted. But because because he had seen. Ethan. My son. I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound from his room. But his door stayed closed. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence. And when morning came, that silence stretched into something heavier. I knocked on his door. Ethan? My voice felt too thin, too fragile. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. Sweetheart, can we? The door opened. He stood there, his face blank, his eyes dull. But I could see it, the weight behind them. The hurt. The confusion. The disappointment. My throat tightened. Ethan, please. He didn't answer. Didn't blink. He just walked past me. Down the hall. Down the stairs. Like I wasn't even there. I followed him, my stomach twisting, my hands shaking. But when he sat at the table, when he picked up his spoon and started eating his cereal, he didn't look at me. Not once. Jake was already there. Sitting across from him. Calm. Too calm. Like nothing had happened. Like he wasn't part of the reason my son could barely look at me. I sat down slowly. My chest felt tight, my hands curled into my lap. I looked at Ethan again, waiting, hoping. But he kept his head down, his spoon clinking against the bowl, his shoulders stiff. Jake took a sip of his coffee. No words, but he met my gaze for the briefest moment, a flicker of something knowing, something dangerous, before looking away. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him, to demand he act like he understood the damage we had done. But what would that change? The damage was already there. And then, the sound of a car door slamming. Mark. Back from his trip. The front door opened, keys jingling, the shuffle of bags being set down. A normal morning. A normal moment. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. He walked into the kitchen, running a hand through his hair, sighing like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. God, I need coffee, he muttered. He didn't look at me. Just straight for the coffee pot, straight into his routine. Like always. Like nothing was wrong. Like his son hadn't just seen his wife nearly ruin everything. Like his wife hadn't spent the whole night suffocating under the weight of something she could never take back. I wanted to cry. Not because I missed him. Not because I felt guilty for betraying him. But because I felt nothing at all. I watched him move around the kitchen, watched him pour his coffee, take a sip, glance at his phone. And all I could think was, he doesn't know. He will never know. I looked at Ethan again. His spoon was still. His jaw was tight. His hands clenched. But he said nothing. Not to me. Not to Jake. Not to Mark. And that silence was worse than any scream, any accusation, any punishment I could have faced. Because it wasn't anger. It was something colder. Something that told me I had broken something between us. Something that might never be fixed. And as I sat there, stomach twisting, head spinning, one thought kept repeating in my mind, over and over. What have I done? And worse, what has my son seen? I felt it the moment I stepped away from the table, the weight pressing down on me, suffocating, thick like fog settling deep in my bones. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't tired. I wasn't anything. Just numb. The day moved forward like it always did, like it hadn't shattered into something I couldn't put back together. Mark left for work. Ethan left for school. Jake stayed. I avoided him. I moved through the house like a ghost, sticking to rooms I knew he wouldn't be in, waiting until I was sure he had gone out before stepping into the kitchen, the living room, anywhere he might be. Because if I looked at him, if I let myself see the quiet, knowing way he looked back, I didn't know what I would do. Or worse, what I would let happen. And Ethan. His silence was the worst of all. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He was just gone. Even when he was right in front of me, even when I passed him in the hall, when I asked how his day was, when I tried, so desperately tried, to reach him, he didn't look at me. And maybe that was my punishment. Not being called out. Not being confronted. Just being nothing to him now. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it settle over me again. Did I cross the line? Or did I just let myself feel something for the first time in years? Because wasn't that the worst part? That for all the guilt, for all the shame, there was something else underneath it? Something that had burned through me the moment I had stood in that kitchen with Jake. Something that still lingered, no matter how much I wanted to shove it down. I turned on my side, curling in on myself, gripping the sheets so hard my fingers ached. What if Ethan tells Mark? The thought coiled around me, tight and unrelenting. Would he? Would he say something? I thought about the way he had looked at me that morning, his silence, his stiff shoulders, the way his jaw had clenched. And I realized I didn't know. I didn't know what my own son would do. And that terrified me. Because I knew what I deserved. And I knew that if Mark found out, everything would fall apart. But the worst part? I wasn't even sure if I was afraid of losing my marriage. Or if I was afraid of what I had already lost. I've replayed that night over and over in my head. Every second. Every choice. Every moment I could have stepped away but didn't. And I still don't know what I would have done differently. What could I have done? Would it have mattered if I had never gone downstairs? If I had ignored the restlessness, forced myself to stay in bed? Or had the damage already been done long before that night? I think about my son, his silence, his avoidance, the way his eyes won't meet mine anymore. That's what haunts me the most. Not the guilt. Not the fear of my husband finding out. But the way I lost his trust. Because what kind of mother does this? And yet, I know I'm not the only one who has ever been in this position. I know I'm not the only one who has ever felt invisible in their own home, in their own marriage. I know I'm not the only one who has ever been so starved for love, for attention, for anything at all, that they ended up reaching for the one thing they knew they shouldn't. So, tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have walked away? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Have you ever been so desperate to feel something that you almost ruined everything? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you've ever been in a situation like this. And if you love shocking real-life stories, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. New episodes every week. Because trust me this is just the beginning. Infidelity isn't just about the act. Sometimes it starts in the mind. And sometimes that's even worse. Because the moment you let the thought in, the moment you entertain it, even for a second, you've already taken the first step towards something you can't undo. I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could erase that night, erase the way my son looked at me, erase the way something inside me had already unraveled long before I ever reached for something that wasn't mine to take. But once you cross that line, there's no going back.